In the modern world, we're constantly facing newer exploits, companies being breached, and new forms of ransomware being forced on participants. But when was the last time you heard about a hacking group doing good for cybersecurity? On today's episode of Cyber Studies, we're going to talk about the world famous Cult of the Dead Cow and how their major influences changed cybersecurity as we know it. Let's go. Welcome to Cyber Studies, in the first episode of Book Club, where we summarize important points and interesting facts about hacking and cybersecurity books. If this is your first time here, my name is Giovanni. Thank you so much for stopping by. Cult of the Dead Cow by Joseph Menn is an important book illustrating the untold story of a famous American hacking group that revolutionized the world of information security. From the mid-80s to the late 90s, individuals who wanted to connect with others over expansive distances would need to leverage dial-up modems, know exactly where they wanted to navigate, and colonize with like-minded individuals in water cooler-styled portions of what would eventually be known as the internet. Groups would create these bulletin board-style systems, or BBSs, where text files, or T-files, were distributed like modern-day social media posts. The teenage group initially started by posting things as crude as excerpts from the anarchist cookbook to rock band lyrics, but eventually over time, this group would pave one of the earliest annotated code of ethics or moral codes of hacking history. While adjacent hacking groups like the Legion of Doom or the Masters of Deception were focused on these hack-for-profit style activities, that was the kind of stuff that inevitably led to them being shut down or their members being detained. The Cult of the Dead Cow, or the CDC, was more focused on the human rights side of things. You start to saw activities like nation-states spying on their own civilians, or large vendors would build these big software products without thinking of any security in mind. And that put a lot of problems on the radar of the CDC. So over the first handful of chapters in the book, you kind of see this evolution transpire from these like punk rock, skateboarder type, musically inclined individuals, the jesters of the hacker space, to the same individuals, but now hosting conventions. You see them at the DEF cons and the ho-ho cons. The CDC was actually responsible for bringing federal agents into the space. Initially, federal agents would kind of sneak into these conventions, witness individuals performing these like suspicious acts, and almost entrap individuals and get them in trouble. The whole invite the Fed, spot the Fed, was a big thing that was kind of fostered by the CDC. So over time, you do start to see this change in the industry, very underground to kind of more mainstream. And the group maintains this kind of, laissez-faire, liberal, light on the feet mentality. But you start to notice a change when they meet up with the Boston natives. And spoiler alert, this is where things get really good. So once we have the Texas group and the Boston group, they kind of merge together and create what is now known as the Loft. Once these members kind of both met and started melding together, you start to see both, hardware and software hackers leveraging each other's expertise. And they create the first CDC website. They're starting to take more of a direction in exploration versus destruction. They're dumpster diving outside of these telephone central offices or corporate buildings so they can gain depreciated equipment, manuals, source code, what have you, anything they can kind of use to further their craft. They're shopping outside of these secondhand flea markets, to buy equipment from MIT or any adjacent universities. They're using things in an appropriate manner so they can kind of monkey around and learn without getting in trouble. They're not breaking into these environments without, asking for permission. They're just doing it on their own lab. They didn't have virtual machines like we do today. So their whole objective was basically to improve the overall state of cybersecurity and make it into what the whole industry is today. As the internet began to mature and kind of evolve into this more consumer product, the Loft had way more incentives to kind of evolve as well. From Loft to Loft-heavy industries, Peter Zetsko, or Mudge, made this kind of initiative to take the team into a more full-time model.
And so what they did is they said, hey, if we're working our full-time jobs, we're doing this as a side hobby, how do we bridge that gap? And so they began doing products for system administration and doing things like LoftCrack. LoftCrack was a password cracker that was used for Windows, and it took advantage of this trivial problem that Microsoft really never addressed. And so by having this forced discussion, it kind of inadvertently created a researcher-vendor relation that kind of crystallized the debate on who's responsible when coming to disclose these vulnerabilities in softwares.
Are there any people working for major operating system vendors? Did you get that?
Security, good.
If holes were publicly announced, vendors would kind of get upset or attempt to press legal actions. However, if researchers went directly to the vendors in private, typically the holes were never fixed. They were kind of like brushed off as not being a problem. Very much on brand. The CDC made it a point to kind of like culture jam or socially like engineer the main media. At the time, it was very common that these, attacks were taking place on like home user computers, but it was not off the table to think that this could happen with a NORAD mainframe or something that was on a larger scale that could affect a lot of innocent individuals. So they took it as an approach that any sort of wacky antics they could do while getting coverage would lead to more coverage. Who are these kids doing these things? So the more they could do, the better. And so over time, they kind of developed their own language, their own methodology. None of this was by accident. It was all curated behind the scenes and eventually led to the invention of hacktivism. They actually created the word. It's in the dictionary. So Josh Bushbinder, or commonly known as Sardistic, was another extremely influential member of the CDC. Back in this time, a lot of the security researchers were looking at Linux. That was like the hot new thing. Everyone wanted to get their hands on that. Josh realized that there wasn't a whole lot of research going into Windows, the operating system. And he thought to himself, hey, this is more of the common end user operating system, so any sort of effort would be well appreciated. Come to his surprise, he realized that Windows 98 was like handing a loaded gun to a child. There was like no security on it whatsoever. So unfortunately, it kind of pissed him off, for lack of better terms. He said, hey, this is absolutely ridiculous. Windows is not going to take us serious. And frankly, he wanted to impress the other members of the team like Mudge and the others. So they kind of came up with this plan, to let the media know that something was on the horizon. So around 1998, Back Orifice was born. This program teased heavily prior to its release that DEF CON, it's promising the full control remote administration functionality of the target's machine. And so with all the theatricals that CDC has come to be known for, they basically just came on stage and explained the program. They threw the Trojan, malware into the audience, like with disk and whatever, just chucking them out there, and then start demonstrating like how it actually worked. They're explaining like the level of control you could have, as well as the system like defenders. They comically ran Back Orifice exclusively on port 31337 or Elite and Elite speak. And so if you were a system defender, you could just say, hey, anything that's running on this port, it's extremely abnormal, just don't let it, block it, inherent block. So naturally, this kind of pissed Microsoft off because their hand was forced. You had reporters like the New York Times who were chiming in and saying hey, the CDC's, Sardistic, aka Josh Bushbinder, and that's right, he was outed. They're releasing this software. What will Microsoft do? Unfortunately, they did not get the response they were looking for. Microsoft kind of came back and say, hey, these are all false claims. None of this is actually true. There's nothing proven here. But if you felt really the need to protect your system and you were just absolutely paranoid, you may also purchase the new Windows NT and you'll be guaranteed protected from this stuff. So Microsoft really just brushed it off and kind of, again, made the CDC mad. They weren't taking it serious. So fast forward a little bit, we see the same kind of thing go back and forth. Microsoft patches their operating system. CDC and the Loft, they create a new version of back Orifice, BO2K. They're basically just going back and forth. Like, hey, they fixed the problem, but they didn't really fix the problem. So while this is all going on, the NSA is noticing that, like, hey, Cisco, Oracle, Microsoft, all these big heavy hitter vendors, like, nothing is wrong with their stuff. Like, they're claiming that everything is good, but then we're hearing about the chatter and like the hackers, and we want to know what's really going on here. So there was a channel where in the NSA there was a mild, like a very small connection between a member as well as some of the CDC Loft guys, and he said, hey, we want to talk to the guys on the ground and see what's really going on here. So once again, Mudge was kind of on this forefront. He's like, hey, we can either go straight by outing our own folks, or we can kind of work with the Fed, the Gov, and kind of explain to them how this stuff is working from like a general like theory of operation. So they're not necessarily outing folks, but they're kind of like developing a professional relationship. They're almost acting like the precursor to like vulnerability scanning or like pen testing. That's just at the very early stages of things. And Peter Zetsko, he was like, hey, I would like to, if something were to happen one day, like heaven forbid, we get caught doing something that's, could be interpreted differently. It would be really cool to have folks like in the suits and the brass and like the metal on the shoulders, the military guys, to kind of back them in their corner, kind of like a character case. And so they really did like create this symbiotic relationship where back in the day you couldn't talk to the Fed, without fearing, repercussions. They were developing the security, the cybersecurity field as we know it today. Shortly after the whole Congress debrief by the Loft, they kind of go into this more corporate route. They want to make the money during the whole .com boom. So they do stand up something called the At Stake. It's like a pen testing group, and they basically go through and find like the vulnerabilities and the holes in these, corporate systems. They end up doing this for a good 5 years, a really good run, until eventually being acquired by Symantec, a very reputable brand today. You start seeing things like Veracode. Veracode's like 2 Loft, 1 CDC guy, where you're actually able to see the binaries of the software that you've purchased from vendors. Typically it's, closed behind doors, but you can see what's going on underneath the hood. You are seeing folks like Katie Marcius, who is like the godmother of the bug bounty program we know today. Like she was responsible for one of the first payouts from the Pentagon. You start seeing folks like Windows Schneider, who are responsible for the service pack number 2 for Windows XP, which if you're familiar, it was like the biggest introduction to security, on the platform, making XP one of the most reputable and famous operating systems around in the market. The team then starts going from like these small services, like, big deal things to like becoming the CISO of Yahoo or the CSO for like Google and Facebook. A lot of members from these small circles start kind of going up in the ranks. Spoiler alert, there's actually a member from the team who ends up going to being a presidential candidate. Like, it's so wild to think that like these folks are so embedded in the culture, like the whole hacktivism thing, to like actually making real change in our career field. Not to mention, if you're following the whole what's going on right now in the news, as of recording 2022, Peter Zetsko, or Mudge, is the actual whistleblower to the whole Twitter versus Elon Musk case right now. Like, it's wild that like this group from like 30 plus years is still having a major impact on what we're doing today. Without spoiling every single aspect of the book, Call to the Dead Cow is one of the better reads that you can find when trying to get a good pulse on the cybersecurity culture back in the day. Anything from like the DARPA cybersecurity fast track to like Swamp Rats, the show. Joseph Menn does a fantastic job capturing the essence of this 80s, 90s to current day, influencers in the cybersecurity space. So thank you so much for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing. And if you are interested in purchasing the book, we'll put an affiliate link down below so you can actually pick that up and help out the channel. So thank you very much. and have a good one.